world, I would have timed up this morning's sermon to be the first Sunday that the spring sun greets us on a Sunday morning, right? The warmth and beauty all around, the birds chirping, lows filled with all those mulch bags, right? But I do think we timed it up correctly with that shadow-seeing rodent, that supposedly tells us what's to come, more winter or spring or what's not. This morning we're reflecting on the topic of seasons from Ecclesiastes 3, not obviously the 4 to 8 seasons that we have in the South, but the overall rhythms of life. And we come to this text, and it's interesting, at least as a kind of macro observation at the start, that this is one of those passages, at least the first 8 verses, that resonates kind of inside and outside the Christian community, right? Something interesting about the tender care of God from Psalm 23, or the supremacy of love from 1 Corinthians 13 that non-Christian, Christian alike seems to take comfort in. I recall a few years back, I got asked to do the funeral of a student, a teenager who had been killed in a motorcycle accident. He was in my first youth group. His family, they weren't believers, and so they made it clear that they didn't want a Christian funeral, which is really difficult to figure out how to do. But they asked that I would read this passage from Ecclesiastes 3. It's interesting. But, because at least on the surface, other than acknowledging the reality of death, there's really not that much in this passage that's a tremendous comfort, is it? It's merely acknowledging something to be true about life, but it doesn't give us, even Christians, at least on the surface, much to take comfort in. We're stepping into the passage, we notice kind of at an overall level. Your Bibles kind of help you with this. Look, you can kind of glance back in Ecclesiastes chapter 1. You're going to notice the editors of almost all of your English Bibles are going to indent, starting with verse 2 of chapter 1. You're going to see this set off going through verse 11. Then if you flip over to chapter 7, you're going to see it again in verses 1 to 13. And then we've got a really big chunk in the book of Ecclesiastes starting right around the end of verse 9, going into chapter 10. Then the majority of 10, 11, and 12 are done this way, where the style of the writing shifts for us. And we get something of wisdom sayings, kind of proverbial claims. If you've read the book of Proverbs, you know that your editors do this with huge sections of the Proverbs as well. They take Solomon's sayings and they kind of collect them together, something of a poem, something, again, kind of these proverbial nuggets of thought that get packaged together. And it's interesting. We're picking up a poem, perhaps Solomon even inserting a poem that he's written somewhere else into the flow of the argument here. So he's been lamenting the fact that we can't find meaning or purpose from any of the things under the sun. So the world, money, possessions, power, work, all that's going to come up short. And then he kind of takes us out of that discussion by placing this poem here for us. And at least in my estimation, it's a shift upward. So if you've flown recently, those kind of in the back of the seats, you can click the button that's like My Flight Tracker. So if you're flying, and unless you're really astute at the geography, like you can only tell a little bit by looking out your window. It's got to be a perfectly clear day, and you got to place yourself. But I love watching the My Flight Tracker because it gives like this bird's eye view of where you've been, where you're going, how much longer you've got to get there. It orients you. I think this is what Solomon's doing. He's giving us a My Flight Tracker for our lives. He's zooming out to say, in the midst of all this futility, what are we experiencing? And from that vantage point, from the 30,000-foot perspective, we can make some observations, and I think for this passage, about the sum total of the poem, because it works much like a parable in that it would be really odd here to read verse 2 and make an observation, then read verse 3 and make an observation, because it's meant as a total unit, the way you would read a poem, and you're meant to come to the end and reach some conclusions. So 2 conclusions from the poem, and then 1 from the prose section that follows. First, we should anticipate that life's going to be seasonal. We should anticipate a seasonal nature for this life. I'll tell you why I think this is important. Solomon is writing the book of Ecclesiastes, in my opinion, primarily, or at least importantly, to normalize our expectations. Meaning, when we get to things like money or power or possessions, and they come up short, we're not like, man, never saw that coming, right? He's writing so that we would normalize our expectations when we get there. We should expect this inherent letdown. And the same is true here regarding the seasons of life. Solomon says, friends, this is the rhythm that your life's going to play out on. Verse 1, looking in the text, verse 1, much like, go back to Ecclesiastes 1, verse 2. So there he says, there he says, absolute futility. Everything is futile. And then what follows in that poem is a description of that sentence. Okay, so we got the similar pattern playing out in chapter 3. What he says is, there's an occasion for everything, a time for every activity under heaven. Then verses 2 through 8 explain that. So they're going back and kind of double clicking on that unit. Okay, what's there a time for? What's there an occasion for? In verse 1, the CSB that we're reading out of this morning uses the word occasion. There's an occasion for everything. It's a fine translation. It's an appropriate use of the term. Some of your versions, in fact, if you've memorized this passage, many of your versions are going to say season there. There's a season for every activity under heaven. I think the notion of season has a little bit more color to it for most of us. You've probably seen pictures like this that capture the idea that we know and experience in the world, right? The same location captured at different seasons. There's something about the vividness of this imagery that helps us step into what Solomon is describing here. This is the structure of the physical world. Seasons come, seasons go. Now, there is a reality we acknowledge that this is probably felt more deeply by some of our ancestors than by us living today. Mary Austin describing this reality. One must summer and winter with the land and await its occasions. What are we saying there, right? Our lives are dictated by the seasons. And in previous generations, this was more true than ours. You got up when the sun came up, and you went to sleep when the sun went down, right? The modern use of electricity tricks our mind and bodies to living out of step with the seasons. Farmers know this to be true. You put the seeds in the ground at certain seasons. There's no use trying to plant in the winter. The ground's too hard, it's too cold, it's just not going to work. Now, what I want you to notice about the description of the seasonal here is what we're doing, the term I just used, it's describing, it's not prescribing. So this is not moral, it's descriptive, meaning Solomon isn't saying you need to act as if there are seasons. You need to produce seasons. He's not telling us anything to do at this point. We're going to get to verse 9 before we get anything that we're to do. Rather, he's describing the world. This is how your life will work. And here's where we've got to get inside this passage and do some personal reflection, because much like the seasons that we experience in the physical world, we like certain seasons more than others, don't we? We have this internal mechanism. We like seeing family and friends, the holidays over the winter. But it stinks to get dark at 4:15, doesn't it? Right? We know that none of our griping and moaning about 4:15 darkness is going to change the reality of the seasons. This is just the way the world works. But, good news, it's not always winter, nor is it always spring. So we shouldn't be surprised when those changes happen. Life, however, comes at us really differently. I mean, we have some sense that there are seasons for our lives. Many of us would organize this around the ages of our children, right? We know there's some seasonal cadence to this. Parenting littles, teenage parenting, empty nest, work, seasons of starting a company, seasons of grinding it out, seasons where you're barely making enough to get by, right? But here's the problem. We have an intersection of ideas. The reality that life functions seasonally, and the main conclusion of Solomon's work, which is there's inherent futility baked into all seasons. Okay, notice the intersection of that. Chapter 1, verse 2, absolute futility. That means you're never going to enter one of the seasons that he describes in chapter 3 where you don't also encounter futility. So though there's change, the one constant among those in life under the sun is they're all going to expose some measure of futility for you. And here's where the press becomes. Because we live in a futile Genesis 3 world, we have a really difficult time embracing the season that we're in. We talked about this with work last week. We have this impulse to, I want to get out of this season, in the very same way that many of you are longing for the summer right now, right? Solomon's warning here, though he doesn't make it overt, just the totality of the poem does. You don't have to fear. A new season is going to come. The problem is, when we talk about kind of prescripting morality, if you spend so much of your time fixating on the next season that's to come, you miss out on the good gifts and the obedience that God calls for in the season that you're currently in. So David Gibson, commenting on this idea, I mean, and this has weight to it, doesn't it? When we're dancing, most of us do not realize that we're creating memories with people whom we will one day mourn, right? When we're weeping, we rarely think that in a few weeks' time, we could be laughing again. We have a hard time living in the season. Paul's language in Philippians 4 is incredibly helpful here. It ends with the classic verse that motivates everything from extreme racing to cliff diving, right? I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Back up. I rejoiced in the Lord greatly, because once again you renewed your care for me, speaking of the Philippian church. You were in fact concerned about me, but lacked the opportunity to show it. I don't say this out of need, for I've learned to be content in whatever circumstances I find myself. I know how to make do with little. I know how to make do with a lot. In all these circumstances, I've learned the secret of being content. Whether well-fed or hungry, whether in abundance or need, I'm able to do all things through Christ, who strengthens me. The thing that Paul is able to do through him who gives him strength is be content in seasons, and particularly here in seasons of suffering. There's an Ecclesiastes 3 cadence to Paul's reflections in Philippians 4. I can be content in whatever season God has me in. Perhaps an awareness of the reality of change can help temper our expectations when the winds of change do blow, no matter how much we would like to keep those winds at bay. And it forces a question. Are you content? Right? Are you content? And specifically, are you content in the season that God has you in right now? Man, I mean, if there's a question that brings conviction more for me personally, like I wrestle with this all the time. I'm a super future-oriented guy. I like big projects, long-term goals. I've trained myself over the years to look into the future, to take risk, and act on. And none of that's inherently bad. But like a boxer who kind of wildly throws punches, it leaves you susceptible to get punched back. It leaves you open. And the place that my risk-taking, adventuresome personality leads is to get punched with discontent, to just really struggle to live presently in the moment. Perhaps you find yourself there. Discontent lies at the heart of many of our constant needs for the next thing, whether that's rearranging furniture in your house or the next job or the next relationship. Maybe the job change, the new project, the inability to maintain long-term relationships, hobby hopping, is all an attempt to manufacture a way out of the seasonal nature of the world that you find yourself in. And so, Solomon warns, watch yourself. We do not possess the master plan or blueprint of our lives. We cannot manipulate the seasons. To submit to the seasonal nature of our world is to acknowledge our creatureliness. And that is good for us. Second macro observation. So we should anticipate the seasonal nature of life, but we should also expect seasonal shifts. Expect seasonal shifts. And here's what I mean. So that might strike you as like, well, Matt, that's really redundant, right? I mean, the very term seasons speak of changes. They're shifts, after all. But I want to double down on the point. Because in Solomon's mind, as we look at this point, I want you to notice how significant the changes are in these seasons. We speak, what's the term? Seasonal affective disorder. I think that's the right? So the winter blues, right? That certain seasons have a way of getting on top of you, of kind of crush, you become depressed or discouraged. I think Solomon wants us to see how complex the seasons of our life are going to be. The season that we're in, or the season that looms on the horizon. He's warning us that these seasons are not going to be minor seasonal shifts. They're going to be significant highs and lows that we experience in this world. Categorize them. So let's look at the list from this perspective. So we could easily create it, around good or bad. I like the language one commentator used to categorize this as delights and disquiets. I think that's really beautiful because he's capturing something in the emotional tenor of these experiences. They're not just kind of flatly good, bad, but some delight us, they perk up our emotions, and some bring unrest. They create tension. And we could go through the list, right? Birth, death, plant, uproot, heal, kill, build, tear down, laugh, weep, dance, mourn, so on and so forth. But even as you read those, look at the list, it's not even easy to categorize them this way, is it? Because as I was going through this week, some of them on the list are like, well, it depends. Is this good or bad? Like building or tearing down, for example. Well, which one of those is good? It depends on the situation, right? In some situations, tearing down is actually the really good thing. Speaking or remaining silent, which of those is good? Well, it depends. It depends on the situation and the circumstance. What's true about this list is that life will move. It will shift, and it will shift dramatically. Life isn't all Easter pastels, but it's also not all funeral black, right? But it's got that type of disorientation baked into it. To make matters worse about this list, There's no way to organize it. I dare you. I was going to give you like 2 minutes this morning kind of in the sermon, but that'd be super awkward. To try to go through and, why did he put the things in the order that he put them in? If you want to just, waste an afternoon, read every commentary on this passage that attempts to create some order or structure. None of them agree. And I think that's very instructive. There's no logical progression to this. We can't pair one idea to the next idea. For example, why doesn't Solomon put birth and death and laughing and weeping side by side, right? Those would seem to be combined ideas. Those would seem to logically flow from one to the next, but that's not what he does. There's complexity, disorder to these seasons. So while you and I may be able to organize the details of our day, we cannot manufacture the seasons of our life. There's no predictability to it. There's no pattern. Some good in that, let's acknowledge. If you're in a really tough season, right, not likely to stay there forever. There's likely joy on the horizon. There's some things to laugh at that are to come. But there's an unpredictability about this seasonal nature that makes life really hard, doesn't it? I mean, 5 thoughts that make it tough for me without any commentary here. We don't get to move back and forward in a pattern between good and bad. So we can't anticipate it. No way to predict what season we're getting ready to move into. Secondly, we don't know how long we're going to stay in the season that we're currently in. So if it's the season that we don't like, we have no way, like a roller coaster ride, at least you know how to anticipate the downhill. You're in a tough season, you have no clue how long you're going to stay there. Thirdly, if you're in a relationship to some other people, you tend to move through those seasons at different pacings than the person that you're married to or your family. So you can't even sync up the seasons with the people you're living with. That's frustrating. Fourth, we tend to allow the dark, tough seasons to cast a shadow over the good seasons. We tend to, and fifthly, it's kind of a commentary on the fourth, but we tend to over-identify with the tough seasons in such a way that it becomes our identity that carries us into the good seasons. We forge our identity. We get stuck in a season, and we have a hard time adjusting when the seasons shift. So look with me at the poem again. Perhaps the most overlooked word in the poem is the linking conjunction in each couplet. The CSB uses to link these. A time to give birth, time to die, time to plant, a time to uproot. Other translations use for, a time for birth, a time for death. In other words, you don't have control over the shifting seasons, but there is a purposeful way to live in that season. There is something that's fit for that season. There's a time to do this, and there's a time to do that. There's a time for planting, a farmer might say. It's not a time for harvesting. In other words, there's a right and a wrong way to embrace the season that you're in. Find this in your home, right? For most of us, there are a couple of weird wackos in the congregation this morning, but for most of us, 4 p.m. is the wrong time to eat dinner, right? Unless you're at the seafood buffet and you're 80, right? It's the wrong time to eat. No offense if you're 80 and enjoyed the seafood buffet at 4 p.m. 2 a.m. is the wrong time to work out. It's just odd. Like if you're working out at 2 a.m., something's wrong. Something's broken. 11 a.m. on a Wednesday is the wrong time to do Netflix binging, right? It's just like there's something else you should be doing there. There's a fittedness to this season that Solomon is calling us to embrace. And it works on a macro level, our lives as a whole. There are tasks and burdens and needs and dispositions that are fit for this season of your life that will not be fit for the next season. And it works in micro moments, small seasons within the season. There are moments within your interactions this coming week where it is fit to be quiet. And there are other moments where it is fit to speak up. There are times when it is fit to laugh, and others when it is fit to cry. Maturity, Christian maturity, is found in your ability to match the appropriate action with the fittedness of the season. To live appropriately in the season that you're in. This is a lesson that Job's friends surely did not grab. So the way forward isn't to try to figure out why you're in this season, or to figure out how you're going to get to the next season, but to ask, what does faithfulness look like in this season? Solomon's helping us name the season and adjust ourselves to the season the way we might box up our summer clothes when the winter comes. It's just not fit right now. This is what's called from me. I've quoted Zach Eswine a lot in this series, but I like this notion. We've got to learn to respond teachably to each season. We need grace to relate teachably to the season that we're in. In other words, we need wisdom to learn to live and to act appropriately where God has us right now. I wish we had time to comment on this more, but this is also true in the one flesh relationship of a marriage. It's a really important challenge for us who are married to ask not merely what season am I in and what's fit for this season, but what season is my spouse in? And how do I lend strength to him or her for the season that they're walking through? Thirdly, so life is created in seasonal patterns. Those seasonal patterns have real shifts to them, and we got to figure out what faithfulness looks like in those different seasons. And then lastly, we should submit to God's control of our lives and our world. We should submit to God's control of our lives and of our world. So the structure of chapter 3, back in your Bibles, the structure of chapter 3 isn't resolved in the poem. It's kind of why reading this poem at a funeral is odd, because the poem sets up the tension that the prose in verses 9 to 15 resolve or help us answer. So let's reread, because it's been a moment now. Let's reread verses 9 and following. So he's just reflected on these seasonal shifts, and then he asks, what does the worker gain from his struggles? I've seen the task that God has given the children of Adam to keep them occupied. He's made everything appropriate in its time. He's also put eternity in their hearts. But no one can discover the work that God is doing from the beginning to the end. I know there's nothing better for them than to rejoice and enjoy the good life. It's also the gift of God whenever anyone eats, drinks, or enjoys all his efforts. I know that everything God does will last forever. There's no adding to it or taking away from it. God works so his people will be in awe of him. What is has already been, whatever will be already is. God seeks justice for the persecuted. Now, if we kind of isolate that unit, we've already seen a good number of those ideas at play, right? The lament, the busy work nature of life under the sun. He's just giving them some tasks to keep them occupied. The call to enjoy what comes. But it's here in these 6 verses. Imagine like Solomon's driving a really big bus through the streets of life, and he's got some passengers on the bus already that are helping him reflect and make observations. And in verses 9 to 15, we come to another bus stop, and he invites a few new passengers on. And these passengers are going to ride with him through the rest of Ecclesiastes. He's going to return, they're kind of passenger concepts. He's going to return back to them, and he's going to add some layers to them, but he introduces us to them in these 6 verses, and it helps us think about this seasonal reality. The first passenger concept, God has and he gives what's needed for the season you're in. God has and he gives what's needed for the season that you're in. Verse 11, he has made everything that's appropriate for that time, for that season. The worker strives and struggles. And the tension is, but the seasons just keep coming. He can't change this oscillation of the seasons. He has no control, the way a farmer doesn't have control over the weather outside. But God exists outside of those seasons. And he makes what is appropriate or fit for those who are moving through those kind of radical changes. He's made everything appropriate for its time. Now, I could call names at this point. I'm going to hold off because you guys, you know the dudes that wear shorts and tank tops when it's 15 outside, right? Some of y'all in here this morning, right? And you say, like, bro, what you're wearing is not fit for the season that you're in, right? This is inappropriate. Solomon's point here is that God's wardrobe is not limited. He's not a seasonal God. He's got clothes for every season. He's made everything that's fit for that season, and in his grace, he gives those good gifts to his children. Said another way, you will never walk through a season in which God is limited to supply you with what you need to walk through that season. Never. How does the text go, right? Even when you walk through the darkest valley, right? You can take comfort. You can fear no evil. Why? Psalm 23. Because God is with you. His rod and his staff comfort you. There's nowhere you can go beyond the Good Shepherd's care. Secondly, God has put eternity in our hearts. God's going to give you what you need for the seasons that you're in. And God puts a yearning in your hearts for eternity. It's interesting to think about the placement of this verse. I think the way we typically use it is out of step for the cadence in the passage. Because the idea seems to be this. In life, nothing lasts forever. And if you finish the lyrics to the, Cold November Rain song, right? That's, you got to make a gesture to the over 40 crowd in any congregation. If you didn't get that joke, just, roll with it. Nothing lasts forever. And what's meant to happen is those changing seasons are meant to frustrate us. They're meant to make us long for something that is lasting, right? Something eternal, something that won't change. It's like the fluctuations of seasons if you live in Alaska. You're like, God help us, just let us move to something that's stable, that's fixed, going from 22 hours of sunlight to 22 hours of dark. It's overwhelming. And we long for this fixedness to be on the good side of the chart, right? Like, wouldn't it be great if the seasons would just stop, where everything was good, where there was no fear that the seasons would shift? This longing for a new and better Eden, Solomon says, reveals that those under the sun crave something beyond the sun. Crave something beyond the sun. Thirdly, God does what lasts forever. God does what lasts forever. Verse 14. I know that everything God does will last forever. Notice the all-inclusiveness of that. Like it's like double negative applied positively. Everything he does will last forever. And like not some things he does will last forever, but everything forever. What a unique contrast. Nothing humans do will last forever, but everything God does will. You can't add to or take away from God's plan. God exists outside of our seasons. He isn't prone to the shifting changes of circumstance. He is not limited by Genesis 3 futility. Psalm 115:3. Our God is in the heavens, and he does whatever he pleases. There's an acknowledgement of the supreme control of God beyond the seasons of life under the sun. Which, what is that meant to produce? Verse 15. I'm sorry, the end of verse 14. God works so that people will be in awe of him. This is where these passengers are meant to lead us. This is the acknowledgement, and it's a hint at the overall conclusion of the book. The reality of a God who exists beyond the sun and controls all things under the sun is meant to cause those under the sun to recognize, submit, and revere this God, to be in awe. The existence of a non-seasonal God who is ruling and reigning over all things shifts the perspective from pessimistic hopelessness to hopeful praise. That I am tethered to a God who is not submitted to the seasons of futility in a Genesis 3 world. The case study for this activity is what God did through the life, death, and resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ. He came, a man born into time, into the seasonal rhythms of a futile world. And boy, did he experience them. The adulations of praise as he entered the city to hanging on a Roman cross. He experienced the sum total of the trials of futility in a fallen world. But he was beyond time. Through him, God would do what was beyond time. He would secure the eternal, lasting salvation of his people. Jesus was in time and he was beyond time, the supreme God over all, the eternal Son of God. Why did he do this? So that we might be in awe of him. So that we might be in awe of a God who exists beyond the bounds of time, but willingly enters into time to secure the salvation of his people. And the reality of a God who would do that reminds us of the reality of a God who will enter time and space in our lives and the unique contours of the seasons that we experience to demonstrate care and grace and mercy and help to you in whatever time of need your season finds you in. Praise is the ultimate season transcending activity for humans. It is the one thing that you can say is fit for all seasons. While there's a certain fittedness to the seasons, God is deserving of perennial praise from his people all the time. Which then leads, how would you name your season right now? And what does it look like for you to uniquely praise God in the season that he has you in? What does awe for you look like? And perhaps that shift, rather than bashing your season, hating it, wishing you were in another season, to say, how is God calling for praise for me in this season? Let's let that land on us as we prepare ourselves to receive from the Lord's table. Hugh's going to come and lead us in a moment, but we're going to take 2 minutes to pray. Allow you to reflect on your season and praise in the midst of this season. And then we will come to celebrate our season transcending